Hey everyone, this is chapter 3 of part 1 of The Bureaucratization of the World by Bruno Rizzi. This chapter is called Class Property. Given that Trotsky attributes decisive importance to the fact that the contradiction has not passed from the realm of distribution to that of production, we must conclude that Trotsky imagines Soviet production to have a proletarian character. Here again it seems to us that there is a mirage, and it is not we who are being misled. Some people think that because property is nationalized in the economy plan, production will be a sufficiently socialist character to guarantee the workers' state. In reality, the whole production system is collective, just as in great capitalist enterprises, from being private, property becomes collective. Consequently, it follows, if economic characteristics are the only determinants of the nature of a state, that in the USSR, what we are left with is nationalization and state plans. And now we should look at what the nationalization of property signifies in the USSR. And this time, we too, with no pretensions to being orthodox Marxists, intend to look behind the facts. Certainly, nationalization of property was the first revolutionary step that the proletariat, once in power, decreed in its aim of constructing socialism. But socialist construction came to a halt under Stalinist degeneration. And it is logical that we should ask what became of this nationalization in the social sphere, since it ought to have been followed by the socialization of property. We are told, in a very simplistic way, that property is nationalized. That is pretty slight for scientific Marxists. Who is it that controls this property? Certainly not the proletariat, rather the bureaucracy. Everybody in the camp of agrement is agreed on this. And Trotsky adds that the distribution of goods is carried out so that the bureaucracy appropriates the lion's share. What sort of nationalized property is it that is under the exclusive control of one class? That class appropriating the products as barefacedly as ever did the old bourgeoisie. There exists in Russia an exploiting class, controlling the means of production and behaving as if it owned them. The members of this class do not share out this property, but are themselves in block, and in the form of a class, the true owners of all the nationalized property. Property, after belonging to everybody, and consequently, for ancient man, being non-existent, first passed collectively to communities, then later became private property. Now it seems that it is taking on a collective form again, but as the property of a class. In Russia, the exploiting class has become the owner, thus giving shape to its own juridical social reality. To fend off the hostility of the workers, it seduces them with nationalizations of property, as if that could mean the property of everyone. Even so, it is afraid, and being unable to pursue its aims within a democratic framework, it is obliged, for the moment at least, to create a police state. Forms of ownership must move in step with the system of production. If the exploiting class is not up to fulfilling its historic role, it falls, and a new class emerges which we might describe as parasitic. This is what is meant perhaps by the verdict of history. The contradiction specific to capitalist society between the mode of production and the form of property has been resolved in the USSR without socialism being realized, and without the proletariat becoming the ruling class. Exploitation remains, but instead of being exploitation of man by man, it is of class by class. Man's exploitation, under the pressure of inevitable economic development, has taken on a new form. Private property has become collective, but now it belongs to a class. We know of no other way to define this, quote, national, end quote, property, which does not belong to everybody, which is neither bourgeois nor proletarian, neither private nor still less socialist. Trotsky failed to conceptualize the new exploiting class in Russia. Trotsky never envisaged the progressive destruction of the bourgeoisie throughout the world. Trotsky never Trotsky did not glimpse the ever more remarkable delineation of class property, not only in Russia, but in all totalitarian countries. Trotsky saw the world as a, quote, rotting bourgeois society, end quote. This is not very acute for a Marxist who lays claim to scientific analysis. From Mussolini to Labriola, from Tardieu to Wallace, all the writings of the last quarter of a century are but a single sarcasm leveled at the old bourgeois society. The De Profundis to capitalism has been sung in all languages. Wikipedia says, De Profundis is a letter written by Oscar Wilde during his imprisonment in Reading Jail to, quote, Bosie, end quote, Lord Alfred Douglas. In De Profundis's first half, Wilde recounts their previous relationship and extravagant lifestyle, which eventually led to Wilde's conviction and imprisonment for gross indecency. Wilde indicts both Lord Alfred's vanity and his own weakness in acceding to these wishes. In the second half, Wilde charts his spiritual development in prison and identification with Jesus Christ, whom Wilde characterizes as a romantic individualist artist. The letter begins, Dear Bosie, and ends, quote, Your affectionate friend, end quote. Wilde wrote the letter between January and March 1897, close to the end of his imprisonment. Contact had contacted lapsed between Douglas and Wilde, and the latter had suffered from his close supervision, physical labor, and emotional isolation. Nelson, the new prison governor, thought that writing might be more cathartic than prison labor. He was not allowed to send the long letter, which he was allowed to write for, quote, for medicinal purposes, end quote. Each page was taken away when completed, and only at the end could he read it over and make revisions. Nelson gave the long letter to him on his release on the 18th of May 1897. Wilde entrusted the manuscript to the journalist Robert Ross, another former lover, loyal friend, and rival to Bosie. Ross published the letter in 1905, 5 years after Wilde's death, giving it the title De Profundis, from Psalm 130. It was an incomplete version, excised of its autobiographical elements and references to the Queensberry family. Various editions gave more text until 1962. The complete and correct version appeared in a volume of Wilde's letters. Back to the text. The Profundis to capitalism has been sung in all languages. It seems to us that the task of scientific Marxists, those guardians of the dialectics of class struggle, is not to dispose of the problem with a banal definition. Their task is to understand the movement of classes in this epoch when capitalism is ending, and to define the new forms of ownership, the new social relations. We should then see that the famous surplus value has not even disappeared from this enigma of a state called the Soviet Union. On it, everybody is agreed. Again, surplus value. It is over where this surplus value goes that disagreement lies. Does it go to the non-existent bourgeoisie? No. Perhaps this surplus value goes to the workers? No. Because if that were so, we should be witnessing the construction of socialism in one country, in the land of the, quote, great lie, end quote. Perhaps we should conclude that surplus value will go to the workers' state. For reasons already explained, that would mean the triumph of Stalinism, for which Trotsky stands as public enemy number one. If someone claims that surplus value has disappeared in the Soviet Union, one would have to conclude that labor power is no longer purchased. If someone claims that surplus value has disappeared in the Soviet Union, one would have to conclude that labor is no longer purchased. Then socialism would, against all evidence, have become reality. In reality, there is only one possible answer. Surplus value goes to the new exploiting class, to the bureaucracy en bloc. To the bureaucracy en bloc. If we admit that bourgeois society is breaking up, we mean that society is losing its economic characteristics. The characteristics peculiar to the ruling class are disappearing and that society is in transformation. This phenomenon, already complete in the so-called Soviet state, is taking shape everywhere in the world. Class ownership, which in Russia is a fact, is quite certainly not registered with notaries, not in the most detailed of surveys. The new exploiting Soviet class had no need of such things. It holds state power, and that is worth much more than the old records of the bourgeoisie. It guards its property with machine guns, with which its all-powerful oppressive apparatus is well supplied, and not with little legal scribblings. If fascism, with fascism's ideas on class collaboration, and the state standing above all classes, can maintain the theory of nationalized property as belonging to everybody, we really do not understand how Marxists, even the scientific Marxists, can wriggle out of this point. According to Marx and Lenin, the state is nothing but the instrument of oppression of the ruling class. Indeed, as long as the state exists, classes remain, and property, under the aegis of the state, is managed by the ruling class, using its apparatus of control. Speaking as the Marxists do, the concept of nationalized property is a nonsense. It is anti-scientific, anti-Marxist. Property, according to Marx, from being private, must become socialist, and he meant socialist, at least potentially, even during the period of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Behind the state, in Marxist theory, there is always class, and if an intermediate form of property, class property, was not foreseen, that is because there was almost certainly a false assumption that classes would rapidly disappear after the takeover of the proletariat. But in fact, during the dictatorship of the proletariat, property takes on a class character. It belongs to the workers who administer it and is only potentially socialist. If property is nationalized under a non-proletarian system, property loses its potential to be socialist property, but remains class property. In the case of the USSR, a state where the bourgeoisie is of negligible importance, if the state persists, this must mean that there are still at least two effective classes. And if our common sense leads us to believe that Soviet workers own the means of production, then it becomes logical to suppose that their property is, in effect, in the hands of the bureaucracy. A corps of clerks? Far from it. There is a well-defined owner. The discord in the camp of Argament, and also political confusion throughout the world, stems from not having envisaged a form of property transitional between private property and socialist property. Thus, everywhere the work of Stalin, Mussolini, Hitler is described as either socialist or capitalist, whereas in reality is simply bureaucratic collectivism. In the camp of Argament, strenuous efforts are made to escape these logical conclusions. They sound like cats on heat, making the March nights hideous with their mournful howlings. Lieutenant Neville, when asked, quote, "What is the difference between private and public property? If only the bureaucracy benefits from collective property," end quote, replies, quote, "There is only a difference of degree between capitalist private property and the giant, quote, private, end quote, property of the bureaucracy," end quote. Neville, 1938. What a discovery! Exclamation point. The property of several millions of citizens regarded as a social grouping is to remain private property. Maybe this scientific Marxist would like to tell us what he means by collective property. Perhaps the sum of many small private properties? And why should not socialist property remain private if it is only a question of degree? Perhaps this salon takes human society to be some kind of limited company. We have to look at human society as a whole and not bit by bit. Private property remains private property until such time as the steady process of bringing it under state control changes its characteristics. The same is true of capital until it reaches a certain size. Hegel's dialectic of the transformation of quantity into quality goes for property too, and we will continue to say so, with or without the permission of the camp of agrement. The first appearance of collective property is to be seen as class property, even though it be under the aegis of the proletariat. The Marxists neither foresaw this nor have they recognized it, but that is another matter. If, according to Neville, property that is brought under state control under fascism remains private, whether or not capitalism gets completely submerged in the process, we see no reason why we should not also consider property after the Soviet nationalization process as private, given that in Russia the process has been completed and the bureaucracy is the great beneficiary. If we are to follow Neville, this is the logical if false conclusion. In fact, in Russia, the nationalization of the means of production created a form of collective, but class, property, which resolved the antagonism within capitalism between collective production and private appropriation. We do not employ different criteria in examining social facts. We also insist that the profound economic travails of the totalitarian states, with their nationalizations and their economic plans, leads to the disappearance of this same antagonism. This has important social consequences: the emergence of class property and the domination of the bureaucracy, the disintegration of the bourgeoisie, and the transformation of proletarians into subjects of the state. Referring to bureaucracy in general, Neville continues, quote, whether or not it has title to ownership, and it does not have, bureaucracy cannot freely dispose either of accumulated capital or of surplus value. Even in state monopolies, this property is, for the bureaucracy, in no sense capitalist private property, end quote, Neville. I'm assuming this refers to Pierre Neville, the French Trotskyist. It seems to us that the truth is just the opposite. Soviet bureaucracy does have control of accumulated capital and does distribute the surplus value. Trotsky goes so far as to say, quote, what started as a bureaucratic deformation is about to devour the workers' state and leave nothing behind, and on the ruins of nationalized property, to establish a new possessing class, end quote. We should add, who controls the economy? Who sets these 5-year plans? Who fixes prices and wages? Who decides on public works, industrial installations, etc.? Who, if not the Soviet bureaucracy? And if the Soviet bureaucracy is not in control of property, who then does control property? Who is responsible for the distribution of surplus value? Is it perhaps the defunct Tsarist bourgeoisie, or world imperialism, or the Russian working class? Neville gives us no explanations, and he goes on, quote, is it then a new form of property ownership of relations historically established on the basis of collective appropriation, but for the benefit of a particular class, the bureaucracy? In this case, we have to admit that the bureaucracy is making use of the system just like a capitalist class, appropriating surplus value as if it were a capitalist enterprise, end quote. End quote, Neville. Yes, precisely. Moreover, it must be conceded the bureaucracy benefits from a class-divided society, not as a capitalist class, but as a bureaucratic class. The bureaucracy lays hold of surplus value not as does an individual capitalist enterprise, but as an exploiting class en bloc. Neville, on the other hand, replies as follows to his timid question. Quote, history shows us that the production, and appropriation, of surplus value is neither special to nor limited to liberal capitalism or private monopoly. Land rent and surplus value, which existed under feudalism, gained their full significance with the market economy and later industrial development. It continues to exist in the USSR in spite of the denials of Stalin, Bukharin, and their school. But here they are nationalized, and therein lies an essential difference. If we want to understand the nature of present-day Soviet society, we must avoid errors on this matter too." End quote. Neville. With his back to the wall, forced to the inescapable admission, the surplus value, quote, "takes on its full meaning," end quote, in bureaucratic collectivism too, this disciple of Trotsky gets round the difficulty decidedly unscientifically. He underlines the ambiguous anti-Marxist reactionary position, according to which land rent and surplus value are nationalized in Soviet society. He also sees an essential difference, exclamation point. We'll answer him in the words of his master, who, in The Revolution Betrayed, expressed himself as follows, quote, "It is perfectly true that Marxists, beginning with Marx himself, have employed in relation to the worker state the terms state, national, and socialist property as simple synonyms. On a large historic scale, such a mode of speech involves no special inconveniences, but it becomes the source of crude mistakes and of downright deceit when applied to the first and still unassured stages of the development of a new society, and one moreover isolated and economically lagging behind the capitalist countries. In order to become social, private property must as inevitably pass through the state stage of the caterpillar. As the caterpillar, in order to become a butterfly, must pass through the pupal stage. But the pupa is not a butterfly. Millions of pupae perish without ever becoming butterflies. State property becomes the property of, quote, the whole people, end quote, only to the degree that social privilege and differentiation disappear, and therewith the necessity of the state. In other words, state property is converted into socialist property in proportion as it ceases to be state property. And the contrary is true. The closer the Soviet state rises above the people, and the more fiercely the Soviet state opposes itself as the guardian of property to the people as its squanderer, the more obviously does the Soviet state testify against the socialist character of this state property. End quote. Trotsky, The Revolution Betrayed. Does it not also appear that as a consequence of so-called nationalization of property, land rent and surplus value are effectively nationalized? That is to say, they belong to the whole people? The only essential difference is this. The exploding class which gains the surplus value is no longer the bourgeoisie. Rather, this honor now falls upon the bureaucracy. Neville relies on an identity between nationalized and socialist property, which seems to us neither very scientific nor Marxist. In Marx's time, such a mistake would have been excusable, but the same mistake is unpardonable in his disciples, for now, even if they were not very clear, the master's forecasts have taken on social substance. Do we really want to appraise the nature of present-day Soviet society? If so, it is exactly this kind of error we must avoid, and we must deepen our understanding of what nationalized property represents in social terms. Clearly, this work must be undertaken in a scientific Marxist way, if that is more to the liking of the Knights of Agremont. We do not pretend our own work is finished. We have only begun. Following this path, even the advent of the totalitarian state to the world scene will become clearer to those who, up until now, have shown a complete misunderstanding of fascism, branding fascism as the savior and continuator of capitalism. In these regimes, a new managerial class, in process of formation, announces that capital is at the service of the state. This class dictates the course of events, already to a large extent, fixes prices and wages, and organizes the national economy according to a predetermined plan. Clearly, property and the means of production does not take individual form in such a simple way as that in consumption goods. These latter are for personal use. The former are as immovable as the mountains. There is no owner, neither class nor state, which can load these up and carry them off to wherever it wishes. It is no wonder there are times when it is hard to decide who exactly is the owner. In the USSR, in our view, it is the bureaucrats who are the owners, for it is the bureaucrats who hold power in their hands. It is the bureaucrats who manage the economy just as was normal with the bourgeoisie. It is the bureaucrats who take the profits just as do all exploiting classes who fix wages and prices. I repeat, it is the bureaucrats. The workers count for nothing in the governing of society. What is more, the workers receive no share in the surplus value. And what is still worse, they have nothing to do with the defense of this peculiar nationalized property. Russian workers are still exploited, and it is the bureaucrats who exploit the workers. Today, the nationalized property of the October Revolution belongs in its entirety to the class that controls it, that exploits it and guards it. It is class property. The system of collective property became established in the course of the evolution of capitalism. Private property could not escape collectivization. The reality is that collective property is not in the hands of the proletariat, but in the hands of a new class, a class which, in the USSR, is already an accomplished fact, whereas in the totalitarian states, this class is still in the process of formation. Whereas in the totalitarian states, this class is still in the process of formation. The end. Thank you for listening.